This is Catherine Lambrecht. I'm with the Highland Park Historical Society. It's June. It's so surprising. I'm sorry, this year is just going way fast, but it's fast because of all the changing dynamics and activity, which I just adore. Program tonight is related to this book, I know you can see it, The Land of Lincoln. And the publisher has very kindly given a 30% discount. And there's information, if you got the email, it's in there. If you didn't, I will put it in the chat so you'll know all about it. So our program tonight is Charles Titus, an emeritus member of the history department at Eastern Illinois University. He's co-editor of When the Nation Called a Third Time, Army Officer Candidate School at Fort Knox, Kentucky, the Vietnam era. So Charlie, I'm turning this over to you.
Thank you very much. All right, terrific. Well, I appreciate very much the opportunity to be with the members of the Highland Park Historical Society this evening. And of course, we're doing this with the wonders of technology. And I'd like to extend my thanks to Kathy for arranging this and for guiding me through the intricacies of Zoom and the other technical things that we had to deal with. So here I am, I guess probably 180 miles or so south of where you all are, up in the Chicago area in Highland Park. And we're doing this, as I said, through the wonders of digital technology. And that really sort of leads me into something that Kathy and I were talking about earlier, and that is how we oftentimes, when people talk about the state of Illinois, they talk about Chicago and downstate. And I'm, of course, downstate, but frequently, as Kathy and I were talking, a lot of people kind of bifurcate the state into Chicago and downstate, even if they're talking about someplace like Dixon or someplace like Galena over in the northwestern part of the state in Joe Daviess County, which really isn't downstate, but it's outside of Chicago. And there were a couple of guys wrote a book called Picturing Illinois, John Jekyll and Keith Scully. Jekyll's a geographer and Scully is a historian. And they sort of address that question. And they use the term Chicago and beyond the metropolis. And everything outside of Chicago is Illinois beyond the metropolis. It's not really downstate, but it's outside of Chicago and the Chicago area. So that's a kind of a very common, I think, description or bifurcation of the state when people talk about it. But Jekyll and Scully make a good point in that in a lot of ways, when we talk about Chicago and downstate or Chicago and beyond the metropolis or the metropolitan area, which would include the suburbs such as Highland Park, that it's really a sort of a false dichotomy. Because Illinois today and throughout its historical existence, at least throughout statehood, and the rise of Chicago a couple of decades after that, has really been in a kind of there's been a kind of a symbiotic relationship between Chicago and the rest of the state. Obviously, the two regions have existed that way for a long, long time. And the wealth of Chicago and the Chicago area, in large part, depends on products from outside of Chicago, products coming in from rural Illinois and even broader than that, from the entire hinterland of the city that extends out in all directions in the Midwest. And raw materials of all kinds, even human capital, people, come into Chicago from other areas, Scully and Jekyll argue, and are brought there initially by a road system, rather primitive initially, and then later on by the development of railroads after the 1840s and 1850s, and then finally by modern highway systems and air travel. By the same token, the rest of the state benefits obviously from Chicago, talking about that symbiotic relationship. And all kinds of products come from Chicago to the rest of Illinois, manufactured products, and today even digital products that have their origin in Chicago flow out of the city and the suburban areas into the rest of Illinois and into the Midwest. So it is a kind of a symbiotic relationship, as those two guys point out, and really the two areas work together. And the book that I wrote, Exploring the Land of Lincoln, The Essential Guide to Illinois Historic Sites, I sort of tried in a way to move away from that separation of Chicago and the rest of Illinois. The book is organized really in two ways. It's sort of organized chronologically, but it's also organized. There's a geographical table of contents. There's a chronological table of contents in the book, but also a geographical table of contents where I divided these. There are 20 sites, 20 historic sites in the book, and those are divided into 4 areas: Southern Illinois, Northern Illinois, Central Illinois, and of course, Chicago. So I tried, when I approached writing this book, I tried to incorporate historic sites from all of those areas. And of course, speaking of Chicago as one of those sites, Kathy and I were discussing earlier that I might want to talk a little bit about one of the Chicago sites, and we can certainly talk about, and we'll talk about others this evening, but one of the ones that she suggested I might want to share with you is the Southside Community Arts Center. It's located at 3831 on Michigan Avenue, and it's a wonderful art museum that grew out of the, in part, out of the Great Migration of African-American folks from the Jim Crow South into Chicago in the early part of the 20th century. Those folks were escaping a very undesirable Jim Crow situation in many of the southern states. And about the time that the First World War happened, there was an increasing number of economic opportunities working in various industries in Chicago that also attracted those folks into essentially the southern part of Chicago, into what is usually referred to as Bronzeville. And there were a group of African-American artists that worked in something called the Arts and Crafts Guild, who wanted to see a place where African-American art and cultural items could find a home. And so they worked very assiduously to do that. And as they were doing this in the 1930s, of course, the Great Depression descended upon America. And one of the things that, one of the good things that grew out of the Great Depression was the opportunity for people who were unemployed because of the ravages of the Depression to find employment through one of those alphabet agencies that came out of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. And the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, was one of those, but and that focused largely on business and industrial kinds of unemployment, putting people to work in those kinds of businesses and industries, rather than, I think it was Roosevelt's philosophy that they we would be better off if those sorts of people were earning a paycheck rather than just getting relief payments. There were relief payments, of course, as part of the New Deal, but he preferred, I think, in many instances that people were actually working for something, producing something and getting paid for it. And that was the idea behind the Works Progress Administration. And a subset of the Works Progress Administration was the Federal Artists Project, or the FAP. And through the FAP, because Roosevelt pointed out, he says, these people who are, and there was a Federal Writers Project, a Federal Artists Project, and so on. And he said, people who are in the arts, people who are writers, these folks have been affected by this economic hardship too, and we need to do something for them. So they created a Federal Artists Project, and the Southside Community Arts Center was intimately linked with that. There was a fellow in South Carolina, I believe it was, that had a really stunning success with establishing community art centers in that state. And the director of the Federal Arts Project saw this going on and wanted to see it in other places as well. And one of those other places was in Illinois, in Chicago. And so he worked with the director, the Illinois director of the Federal Arts Project, who in turn worked with a guy named Peter Pollock, who was an artist and had a gallery in Chicago, who had displayed African-American works of art previously. And Pollock then was familiar with some of the folks in Bronzeville who, in the Arts and Crafts Guild, who had been working toward setting up some kind of a place, a community arts center, to encourage people to participate in art, to go to lectures on art, to display art, and so on. So Pollock worked with a number of people in the Bronzeville area. One of the most prominent was a woman named Margaret Goss Burroughs, who became very enthusiastic about setting up this art center. And they engaged in a lot of different fundraising projects, one of which I thought was pretty interesting, called the A Mile of Dimes project. And I guess the idea was to collect enough dimes. This may have sort of been related in some way, or using the terminology of the March of Dimes. I'm not sure about that. But they had this project called the Mile of Dimes fundraising campaign. And I guess the idea was to, I was looking at this earlier to see how many dimes you could get in a foot and multiply that by 5,280, or however many feet there are in a mile. And it turns out it's something like, I don't know, around $11,000 or $12,000 could be raised if you had a mile of dimes. And that was one of the fundraising projects that Margaret Burroughs worked and others worked on. And they also held an artists' ball to which people were invited in a kind of a celebratory function, which still continues even to this day. And they ultimately were able to purchase a beautiful old Georgian mansion that had belonged to a guy by the name of George Severns, who was a prominent grain dealer. He and his dad were prominent grain dealers in Chicago. And he had built this house at 3831 South Michigan Avenue. And it's a lovely place. But the neighborhood had begun to change, and a lot of the wealthy people of Chicago were starting to build up on what became the Gold Coast. And so he moved away and his house became available. And the folks who were working on raising funds for the Southside Community Arts Center purchased this house with the money that they had raised. And they had a couple of guys who were interested in the Bauhaus architectural ideas from the original Bauhaus in Germany come in and remodel the house inside using the many of the Bauhaus architectural features. And that became the center for the Southside Arts Center. And it's still there today. It's still located. They've been in that particular location ever since the original center began back in the late 1930s. And of course, because of its intimate linkage with the Federal Arts Project, Eleanor Roosevelt visited there and dedicated the opening of the Southside Community Arts Center in 1941. And in fact, I think today, if I am not mistaken, the Southside Community Arts Center is having a virtual celebration of their 80th, I guess would be 80th year anniversary from when it was dedicated in 1941 by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And it has functioned as an arts center in the Bronzeville area on the south side of Chicago ever since then. It bumped into a few problems during World War II and then especially after the Second World War, because some of the people that had been involved in starting it had flirted, I would say, as a number of people did in the 1930s with the Communist Party. And while there may have not been membership or any real close connection during the McCarthy period, there was suspicion of some of these people, and there was some negative attention focused on some of the folks who had been associated with the Southside Community Arts Center. But it ultimately passed through that and continues on as a really bright spot for the arts, African-American arts there on the South Side. And when I wrote this book, I visited every one of the 20 sites that are in the book. Fortunately, it was done before the COVID situation. And I went to the Southside Community Arts Center. And Masika Myers, who was at that time the executive director of the center, showed me around the place. We talked a lot about it. We went up to the various floors in the center and had an opportunity to see some of the pictures that were, and other artwork, sculptures and other kinds of art that were on display there. And it was a very rewarding and enjoyable experience. And I would encourage you to visit there if you have the opportunity. Now, I believe that they may, I don't know what they've done since we've gone into, what is it, I guess, phase 5 here in Illinois in dealing with the COVID-19 thing. But I think at the last I looked, which was just in the last day or two, I looked at their website, they were still closed. But I suspect that that will change pretty rapidly. And I would really encourage you, if you're interested in art and interested in the development of African-American art as it flourished there and continues to flourish there, I would encourage you to visit there. It's really a remarkable experience. And I did want to say earlier when I was talking about the sort of symbiotic relationship between what Scully and Jekyll call Chicago and beyond the metropolis, that there are many wonderful products that come out of Chicago to the rest of the state and the region. And one that is particularly vital to me is the Tootsie Roll Company, which is located on down on South Cicero and manufactures that great candy. And so that's something that comes out of Chicago to all the rest of us, whether we're downstate or anywhere else outside the metropolis. So we're getting, and Solo cups, I think, are made in what would all of those college kids do when they have their parties in fall semester out in the front of the houses where they live, if they didn't have those Solo cups, which I think are made in Chicago. But anyway, I did not ignore Chicago when I wrote this book, because obviously it's a very important part of our state. Actually, it almost wasn't a part of our state when Illinois came into the Union in 1818. The original plan had called for the border, the northern border of Illinois, to extend straight west from the southernmost tip of Lake Michigan. And fortunately, our representative in Congress, who was shepherding the non-voting representative, of course, at that point, who was shepherding our Enabling Act through Congress, convinced them that they should add about, I think it was around 30 miles or so north of the original border. And so Chicago, or what became Chicago, became a part of Illinois. Otherwise, it would be Chicago, Wisconsin, I guess, if that hadn't happened. But we didn't ignore Chicago. We've got a couple of other sites from Chicago in the book. The Chicago Water Tower, the old Chicago Water Tower, which was built in 1869, designed by William Boynton, the architect. One of the few structures that was designed really to provide water pressure after the intake cribs were built out in Lake Michigan, and then water was pumped because they had had so much trouble with polluted water from the Chicago River in the mid and early parts of the late parts of the 19th century. They built these intake cribs off of the shore of Chicago, and then that water which was quite an undertaking in itself, to dig this tunnel underneath the surface of Lake Michigan to go out and to construct this so-called crib, which then intook water and was pumped in by means of a pumping station, which is right near the water tower there, and then given pressure by being elevated into the Chicago Water Tower. And of course, when the Great Chicago Fire happened in 1871, the water tower was very quickly emptied trying to put that fire out, and was actually one of the structures that was not damaged. The fire did damage the pumping station, caused the roof of the pumping station, which is just across the street from the water tower, to fall in. But the water tower pretty much escaped unscathed and remained there and remained in use for a number of years after that. And it was actually built, at least as I understand it, to conceal the standpipe that was constructed to give the height that would then provide the pressure for the Chicago water system. So it's still there in Jane Byrne Plaza, as I'm sure you know, right up there by where Chicago Avenue intersects with Michigan Avenue. It's a very nice spot. You can sit there in the little plaza on one of the benches and have your lunch or watch people go by, and watch all the pigeons who come in and land on the water tower. I think it was a very remarkable architectural achievement, although some people were critical of what it looked like. But it's still there. We covered that in the book. We also did a chapter on the Haymarket Market Riot gravesite with the statue that's there. That's not in Chicago. It's in a suburban location, but we covered that. And of course, the Haymarket affair itself occurred in Chicago, but the people who were executed as perpetrators of that, rather unjustly, I think most people think, are buried out in Forest Home Cemetery in suburban Chicago. So we covered that. And Hull House, which is one of my favorite sites. I used to tell my students that I think if I would have been a guy living in 1889 or 1890, when Jane Addams was, I taught Illinois history for a number of years at Eastern Illinois University. And I used to tell these kids, I think if I had been a young guy in 1889 or 1890, when Jane Addams and Ellen Starr moved into Hull House, I would have probably fallen in love with Jane Addams, because I think she was really a neat lady. I don't know if that feeling would have been reciprocal or not, but she was a very remarkable woman, as was her co-founder, Ellen Gates Starr. So we did a chapter on Hull House, which was one of the earliest settlement houses in the United States, and a really remarkable undertaking for these two young women who were college educated and who had traveled and were relatively affluent, particularly Adams, had traveled to Europe, traveled to England, and saw Toynbee Hall in London on the London's East End, which was a horrible slum area in the late 19th century in London. And they were inspired to do something like that back home. They had both gone to Rockford College, Rockford Female Seminary, as it was known then, and now Rockford College. They were good friends there. And Jane finished school there, hoped to be a doctor, had some health problems of her own while she was attending a medical school in Philadelphia. Ellen had become a teacher in Chicago, teaching at a rather prominent young women's school in Chicago, where she met a lot of the elite, affluent families of Chicago. But they had traveled to England and saw Toynbee Hall and decided they wanted to do something like that when they came back home. And so they looked around and they found this old mansion that had belonged to a man named Charles Hull, located at what's now 800 South Halsted Street in Chicago. And right there where Polk Street, a little kind of an abbreviated strip of Polk Street, intersects with South Halsted, right just butting right up against the campus of the University of Illinois at Chicago. In fact, it's a part of the campus, and it's just right adjacent to their, I believe it's their Union building. So they came back and they found this place, and they negotiated with the woman who was Charles Hull's niece to see if they could start this settlement house. And she agreed that they could use a part of it. It was the other parts of the house were occupied by other things, a furniture company and a school desk company, I think it was, and some other things. And so they began in 1889, this September 18th, I think it was, 1889, this settlement house in Chicago. And the idea that they had, and they took part of this from Toynbee Hall, I think, where a lot of young guys from Oxford and Cambridge universities were living at Toynbee Hall and teaching classes and so on to working folks who lived there on London's East End. And they sort of did that same thing initially at Hull House. And they tried to appeal mostly, I think, to their immigrant clientele, which was largely Southeastern European in that part of Chicago on the near west side, from Greece, from Italy, and from some other places in Southeastern Europe. And the idea was that I think that they had initially, and they changed their approach after a little while, but they thought that if they could share some of the elements, I guess, of middle class or upper class living in terms of art, and literature, and so on, with the folks who lived around there, they could help them. But they also they also held classes of other kinds where they helped people sort of thread their way through things that they needed to thread their way through, the various kinds of bureaucracy to get services and that kind of thing. So they were doing a lot of that kind of thing in the initial 2 or 3 years, I think, of Hull House. So they had a very extensive educational program, and some really big names participated in that. John Dewey, for one, from the University of Chicago, which was just being constructed at that time. And Dewey, I think, came to the University of Chicago in about 1892 or 1893. He was a regular visitor at Hull House and taught some classes there. Both Starr and Jane Addams taught classes there to their clientele. But pretty soon they went beyond that. They opened a kindergarten. A young woman named Jenny Dow from the north side of Chicago, came from a wealthy family, had some connections, I think, probably through Ellen Starr, came and became a kindergarten teacher. And they opened a kindergarten teacher for kids from the neighborhood. And that gave the moms in the area a little bit of free time to do stuff that they hadn't been able to do before. And they continued to teach these classes. And then they began to change their philosophy a little bit. They continued the classes. They continued to assist people in the way they had before, but they also began then to become much more active, I guess you could say politically, where they worked with or tried to work with the guy named Johnny Powers, who was an alderman from that area, Irish politician, as so many were in late 19th century Chicago, to get the streets cleaned up, to make sure the garbage containers, sort of a dumpster-like thing with these big wooden crates that sat out, that were frequently overflowing with garbage, weren't picked up. The garbage city employees weren't doing their job. And they began, Starr and Adams began to try to become more politically involved in trying to remedy the conditions that had brought about the problems in the near west side there. So they did a lot of good. Ellen Starr actually ran for political office on the Socialist Party ticket. She ran for alderman. She wasn't elected, but she did become very politically active. And that went on pretty much up until I would say the 1920s or so, especially maybe up until the late 1920s when the Great Depression hit. And at that point, things sort of changed because the whole country was in obviously dire straits, and the problems of the progressive era that they sort of represented and tried to address sort of faded into the background. In addition, Adams had become involved in the peace movement during the First World War and had unfortunately alienated a number of people. But by the late 1920s, that had sort of passed, and she had regained a lot of her stature. In fact, she started to appear on lists of influential women or most important women, kind of thing, and sort of regained her stature there. Ellen Starr moved away from Hull House. She had been a person, I think, that had been searching for some kind of spiritual fulfillment, and she ultimately found that by joining the Roman Catholic Church. And she moved out of Hull House to a convent in New York, I believe, and suffered some health problems and was confined, I think, to a wheelchair and ultimately passed away there. Jane Addams, of course, died also in the early 1930s after illness. and she's buried in Cedarville by her father in a cemetery located there, where in her hometown of Cedarville is where she was originally from. So Hull House is really emblematic, I think, in so many ways of that progressive era ethos that swept much of the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it manifested itself in a lot of different ways, politically, through the emergence of the Progressive Party and people like the La Follettes in Wisconsin and so on, but also in these enterprises like Jane Addams and Ellen Starr did there at Hull House. So those are some of the places that we did in this book in Chicago. And I, again, as I said with Southside Community Arts Center, I would really encourage you, check your website for each one of these, of course, to see if they're back in business again. But I would really encourage you to go to those sorts of places and experience these aspects of history that are right there in the Chicago area. And some of these are really, I think, of course, I'm a history guy, so it affects me maybe in a way that it wouldn't other people, but there's something to stand there in Hull House and to think about what happened there, what was going on there. That is really a moving experience. Or to go out to the Forest Home Cemetery and look at the statue there that honors or has been erected in remembrance of the guys who were executed for the Haymarket bombing, is really a moving experience in many ways. So I would encourage you to go and to visit those. As far as the rest of the book is concerned, I tried to, we go all the way down to Fort Massac in Massac County, Illinois, which is way down on the Ohio River, kind of where the Ohio River cuts a big inverted U in the bottom of Illinois. And right there by Metropolis, the home of Superman, as they like to say in Metropolis, to Fort de Chartres, and then we come up to Vandalia, to the Vandalia State House that served as the Illinois capital in the state from around the second Illinois capital, the first one being Kaskaskia, from about 1838 to 1840 or so, 1837 to 1840, before the capital moved to Springfield. But the Vandalia State House is there. And as I said in the book, when you go into that place, it's just redolent of history. And you can almost feel like you're there where some of these notable people like Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln were in the legislature as lawmakers. So we were there, came up to just right here where I am, about 10 miles south of where I'm speaking to you right now, at Lincoln Log Cabin State Historic Site, and the Stephen Sargent home, which is also located there. And that's a cabin that is a reconstruction of a cabin where Abraham Lincoln's stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, and his dad, Thomas Lincoln, lived. Abe did not live in this cabin, but his parents lived there, and he visited there. Abraham Lincoln visited Coles County and visited his parents there. And then the other house, which was moved in there, probably 20 or 30 years ago, I guess now, is the home of Stephen Sargent. And Stephen Sargent was a quite different kind of guy than Thomas Lincoln. And part of what they are trying to convey at Lincoln Log Cabin Historic Site is, which is set in 1845. If you go down there and you visit it, it's always 1845 at Lincoln Log Cabin State Historic Site. And they're trying to convey two different kinds of life that were one that was sort of emerging at that time, and the other one which was pretty traditional. Thomas Lincoln was a subsistence farmer, a guy who grew crops primarily for himself or to trade with his neighbors around a pretty defined area there. Stephen Sargent, on the other hand, was more of a progressive farmer, a modern farmer. And you can see that by looking at the two kinds of structures that are there. The cabin where Thomas Lincoln and Sarah Bush Lincoln lived, parents of Abraham Lincoln, is pretty typical log cabin with the logs and the chinking and so on. It's a two-room cabin. It's an interesting structure because the original cabin, there was a group of entrepreneurs, I guess you would call them, who got the idea that they would purchase that cabin, disassemble it, and move it to Chicago and exhibit it in the Columbian Exposition in 1892 in Chicago. And they did that, apparently, and put it on display up there, someplace near where the fair was taking place. And at that point, it disappeared. And no one has ever found out what happened to it. Some people think it was cut up and used for firewood after the fair. Some that it was being shipped somewhere and sank on a lake boat. But the truth of the matter is nobody really knows. But they did have photographs of it and descriptions of it. And so, again, going back to the New Deal, one of those alphabet agencies, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, rebuilt the cabin on the spot where it had been located, sited, and used photographs and other kind of archaeological information to reconstruct it. So the cabin there is very much, although it's a replication, it's a very accurate replication of the cabin of Thomas Lincoln. Two-room cabin, pretty primitive, fireplace in the middle that heats both of the rooms. It's a bedroom and a kitchen. And then Stephen Sargent's house looks quite different. It's located maybe 200 or 300 yards away from the Lincoln cabin. It's a clapboard sided house, looks almost modern, has a separate kitchen, as we call it, a summer kitchen, but is a completely different kind of structure, even though it's contemporaneous with the cabin. And Sargent himself was a different kind of farmer. He was, as I said earlier, a more progressive farmer. He practiced crop rotation. He read agricultural journals. He did a little bit different kind of agriculture than Lincoln did. So that Lincoln Log Cabin State Historic Site is a very good look at those changing dynamics in the history of Illinois agriculture there. So that's a site that you might want to see. We went to Thomas Lincoln's grave site, which is located just very near, about a mile northwest of his cabin, where Thomas Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's father, and his stepmom are buried there. And we did a piece on that. We did the state capitol, the old state capitol in Springfield, which replaced the one in Vandalia. We did New Salem, Lincoln's New Salem. Talked a little bit in that chapter about the Lincoln arrived there in 1831. A guy that he had taken a flatboat to New Orleans with offered him a job. Says, I'm going to start a store here in New Salem, which is a small community. It was doing pretty well in the late 1820s, early 1830s. He says, I want to start a store here, and you've done a great job on this flatboat, and I'll hire you as my storekeeper. So Lincoln said, okay, I'd like to do that. And the guy's name was Dennis Offutt. who was going to give Lincoln this job. And so Lincoln came back and he went to New Salem, and the store wasn't ready to go. So Lincoln kind of worked odd jobs until the store started. And then he worked for Dennis Offutt. But apparently Dennis Offutt was a sort of a loquacious guy and liked to brag a lot about Lincoln. And he was bragging that Lincoln, Lincoln can do this, Lincoln can do that. And he's one of the best wrestlers, because Lincoln had kind of a reputation for that back where he'd come from earlier. And there was a group of guys, and I think we are kind to call them frontier ruffians, called the Clary's Grove Boys. And one of their leader was a guy named Jack Armstrong. And they kind of had a guy that was their sponsor, and they said, "Hey, wait a minute, you're not going to convince us that this guy can beat our guy, Jack Armstrong." And Dennis Offutt said, "Yeah, he's the best wrestler I've ever seen. He can do it." And Lincoln was pretty reluctant to do this, but ultimately he acceded to that. And he and Jack Armstrong had that famous wrestling match supposedly there in New Salem. And the accounts are that some accounts say Lincoln won, some say that Armstrong won, and some say it was a draw. So who knows? But that was sort of an interesting thing that happened there. And of course, Lincoln ran a store with a guy named Barry, which didn't do very well. And then he went off to the Black Hawk War, came back, decided he wanted to run for the legislature. He did that, was defeated one time, ran again, was elected. Wanted to become a lawyer, was a kind of an autodidact and taught himself law, and then ultimately moved away from New Salem and ended up in Springfield. And that place has been restored also, and it's a fascinating place to go and visit for a particular chapter in Abraham Lincoln's life. We did the Lincoln Tomb in Springfield, in Oak Park Cemetery there. And it's one of those places I was mentioned in the book, and I was talking to someone earlier about it, that when you go into that place, everybody, when you step in there, you want to whisper, because it's sort of got that ambiance in there. It's the same kind of feeling you get, or that I get anyway, at a place like Independence Hall, when you go in there behind those old brick walls and see those green draped tables where so many seminal things in our nation's history took place: the writing of the Constitution, the writing of the Declaration of Independence, or at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, or Washington's tomb. And it's what I think that what brings that about is you sort of experience something that a guy named William Manchester referred to in another context as the haze of tribal sentiment. And I think you sort of are enveloped in the haze of tribal sentiment when you go into Abraham Lincoln's tomb, and then go back there and see that large red stone marking where Lincoln is interred. So that's a good place to visit. Apple River Fort up in Elizabeth, Illinois, up in Joe Daviess County. Fort that was erected during the Black Hawk War. A battle took place there. A lot of women helped in that battle, making ammunition and reloading muskets and that kind of thing. So there are a lot of places to see that we looked at in the book, and I would encourage you, as soon as we get into travel mode, if you're interested in, as the book's title says, exploring the land of Lincoln, I think you and hope that you would enjoy going to some of those places.
So I have a question for you,
Oh, okay.
if you
Terrific.
don't mind, because
No.
when we met virtually the other day, we had an interesting conversation, because I was talking about how different it is to be Chicago and how the difference is downstate. And one of the examples I gave was sitting in a hotel in Marion, Illinois, and listening to the local politicians say, And please, if you know people in Chicago, tell them to please go to their representative. That was one element. But the part that was also interesting, and I guess I need to learn more about Illinois history. I have to, too bad. Are you still teaching or are you?
No,
You're true emeritus.
I'm emeritus now, yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. But one thing I learned from you that I had not heard before, and if you could do it, because you're a very detailed person, you know your stuff really well, and I appreciate that. But a thumbnail sketch of the 4 waves of migration into Illinois, because I had not heard that before until you mentioned that, and I think people would appreciate that.
Sure. Yeah, and I want to make sure that I don't, I always, when I was teaching, as I said, I taught a lot of different classes at Eastern, one of which was Illinois history, but in all of those, I always tried to wrap up things on time. So I didn't have these kids, like this, and I could see them back there, who's this guy?
In the land of Zoom, people just quietly leave, and the rest of us are hanging on with all interest.
Well, I don't want to go over time, but I'd be happy to talk about that. Essentially, Illinois was settled in really about 3 or 4 different ways. Obviously, during the French period, and what some of that is in the book too, about the fort that was built at Starved Rock, up on top of the rock by LaSalle in 1681, I think it was. And so there were some settlements there and some settlements around Peoria, but there was some conflict with Native Americans, as there unfortunately was in a number of places. And people, French people relocated down to Southern Illinois, down to a couple of places, both along the Mississippi River. When people began to move then from the East Coast into, particularly after the Revolutionary War, when the British had tried to restrict movement beyond not very successfully, but had tried to restrict movement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Well, now that was gone and people began to move to the west, we had people moving into what is normally called either the Upland South or the Southern Uplands. And that would be the areas of the Carolinas, obviously, in Virginia originally, and then into Tennessee and Kentucky. And a lot of those folks from all of those places, from Tennessee, from Kentucky, from Virginia, from the Carolinas, moved further west and into Southern Illinois. And I tell these kids, and many of the kids in my class are from Chicago, and I say, I hate to disappoint you guys, but Illinois did not start in Chicago. It wasn't settled from Chicago down. It was the other way around. And these folks, Lincoln is a good example. His family is a good example of that. They lived in Kentucky, they moved to Indiana, and then they moved over into Illinois, first further west, and then came back and settled at the cabin I was talking about. So there were a lot of people moving in from these different population hearths into the state of Illinois, one of which was the Southern Uplands. And those folks settled down in Southern Illinois, and Shawneetown, way down in Southern Illinois, and that's another site that's in the book, the old village of Shawneetown, or Old Shawneetown, served as a point of entry, and a lot of people came in that way, and they settled in Southern Illinois, and that was the Southern Upland migratory stream coming from that Southern Upland cultural hearth. The second mainstream came from the mid-Atlantic area, and that would be places like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, some from Massachusetts, and later from Ohio. I know in my own personal family, their roots go back to Pennsylvania. There's a Titusville, Pennsylvania, and they moved into Muskingum County, Ohio, and then over into Illinois, where I guess they stopped. But that was the mid-Atlantic cultural hearth. That was another that was another migratory stream that filled up largely the central part of Illinois. And then we had the New England and immigrant migratory streams that came in somewhat later, and they settled in the northern part of Illinois, especially in the Chicago area, but in northern Illinois. So that was the other migratory stream that came in. Those were lots of European immigrants that were coming over. That was in the later part of the 19th century. Now, of course, there were anomalies to this. For example, the Mormons settled. They came from New York and through Ohio and Illinois into Missouri, and then back into Illinois in 1846 into Nauvoo, another place we talk about in the book. So that was kind of an anomaly coming in from that direction. But mostly these migratory patterns came from those cultural hearths into the state of Illinois. And there's a great book by a guy named Doug Meyer who taught at Eastern Illinois University called Making the Heartland Quilt. And it sounds like it's a book on quilting, but it isn't. It's a book about the settlement of Illinois. And it's a terrific book that shows these settlement patterns and these different migratory streams that came into Illinois. And those gave distinct characteristics to Illinois. There's in lots of different cultural artifacts. For example, the vocalization of our language in Southern Illinois is a lot more akin to people who live in Kentucky or Tennessee. There's a lot of pa instead of pie, a lot of tars instead of tires, sort of thing. That accent that comes from the Southern Uplands up through that area is really predominant in Southern Illinois. A lot of cultural viewpoints and ideas are there. In Central Illinois, you have a different kind of cultural artifacts that are appearing or did appear and remain. Even architectural styles are more reflective of the kinds of architecture that came from the Mid-Atlantic area. And then in Northern Illinois, that's a completely different cultural milieu, I would say, than these others. So there's a real, and I think it's a wonderful thing, is just somebody once said, Illinois is just one big city, and then a bunch of cornfields and bean fields and wheat fields. And that's not really true. There's a lot of diversity in the state. There's a lot of cultural diversity. There's a lot of racial diversity. There's a rich African-American cultural aspect to our state that gave so much in the arts, in the visual arts, but also in music, in the Chicago Renaissance era. And it's just wonderful that we have this diversity and these differing parts of Illinois. So that's sort of a thumbnail sketch of the settlement patterns that brought people into the state from late in the 18th century throughout the 19th and into the early 20th century.
Somebody asked, what was the name of the book about Illinois migration?
It is called I'll get it for you. You can see it. Making the Heartland Quilt.
But what we don't see is the name of the author.
Okay, there is Douglas K. Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R. Making the Heartland Quilt. And then the subtitle is A Geographical History of Settlement and Migration in Early 19th Century Illinois. And it's really a great book. Doug lives here in town. I see him frequently at Starbucks when we go there to have coffee once in a while. And he did a great job on this book. And it was very valuable to me as I was teaching Illinois history, and we were talking about the early settlement of Illinois. And he is a geographer, but he has an awful lot of history in this book. And if you're interested in that, I'd really recommend that you, and I think it's pretty widely available. It's been out a few years, Making the Heartland Quilt by Douglas K. Meyer.
By the way, I have heard, and maybe you can affirm, but did Illinois almost join the South during the Civil War?
No, I don't.
That's okay. I was just, because you
No.
seem like you know that sense better than other people.
No, I would say the answer is no, but there's always a but, right? There was a lot of sympathy in Southern Illinois for the Confederacy. And that was primarily because so many of the people who were living there had origins from many of the states that did end up seceding. You know, Kentucky, of course, did not, and a lot of people from Kentucky were living in Illinois, but there were a number of people who lived in Southern Illinois who were sympathetic to the Confederacy. And even here, right here in Charleston, there was a Charleston Riot, so-called, which happened during the Civil War, was a result of a group of the Southern sympathizers in Southern Illinois and even up into the area here where I am now, were called copperheads, or sometimes butternuts. And there was a strong copperhead or butternut presence in over just east of here in Edgar County. Why, I'm not sure, but there were a number of people who were sympathetic to the Confederacy. And when a group of Union soldiers who were from this area and were home on leave were getting ready to go back and get on a train to go back and resume service on the active front, were gathered in Charleston, and a number of these copperheads came in town, and one of them, the story goes, pulled a gun on a Union soldier and began firing, and the guy was killed, was named Oliver Salee, and a riot broke out, and there were several people killed and wounded, and these were copperheads. So there was sympathy. There were also some, I would have to call them kind of harebrained schemes to pry Illinois from the Union, but those never really amounted to anything. And part of the reason that happened was you had a guy like John Logan, who was from Southern Illinois and sort of kept mum as the crisis was building. And then at a very critical point, I guess, threw in with the Union and became a Union Army officer and rose to a high rank and was something of a hero in the Union Army. And he was from Southern Illinois. So I would answer that question by saying, while there were some strains of Copperhead thinking and some sympathy for the Confederate cause among some people in Illinois, particularly down in Southern Illinois, there was never any real possibility of Illinois going into the Confederacy. And by the way, that same phenomenon appeared in Southern Indiana and Southern Ohio as well. So it wasn't just here in Illinois, but no, I don't think there was ever any chance of Illinois becoming a member of the Confederacy.
Okay, so there was a number of recommendations of books and things like that, which I will give you a copy of the chat just so you're aware of it. But somebody asked, could you please address the mounds at Cahokia?
Yes, I can. Those mounds are dominated by a place called Monks Mound, which is a very large. This is just right near Collinsville, Illinois, right off Interstate 70, down not very far from St. Louis. The whole site is dominated by Monks Mound. It's named after some Trappist monks who had built a monastery there for a period of time. And then there are a large number of other mounds of various kinds that are scattered across the, I think, 200 and some acres of that site there. Those mounds were used for various purposes. I do want to say that there's still a lot that remains unknown about Cahokia and the Cahokians who live there, although there has been an enormous amount of archaeological and anthropological research carried on there for a number of years. But the mounds were used for different purposes. The Monks Mound, the very large one, it's something like 150 feet tall, I think. Most archaeologists and anthropologists believe that at one time had a structure that was either a residence of or a functioning structure of some sort for important people in the Cahokian hierarchy. Some of the other mounds are burial mounds where people have been interred with funerary objects, arrowheads and beads and things like that. One of the most mysterious, I guess, in the interpretation of it is of this particular mound, Mound 72. It's known as Mound 72. Interpretation has changed some over time about exactly what was going on with that mound, but it is the site of a number of burials. A very interesting one is a young man and a young woman in there. Probably forensic analysis would show that they're probably in their 20s, and they're buried very close together, almost on top of each other, with a layer of beads around them and covering part of the woman. And then in another, actually Mound 72 contained some sub-mounds once they began to excavate that mound. They found these other mounds. There's another burial site there in Mound 72 that has a number of bodies in it that have been, looks like they have probably been decapitated. Probably it's conjectured as part of some religious ceremony, perhaps. There's another mound there that has several other bodies in it, laid out at particular angles. There's a fellow by the name of Tim Pawcatutt, who is an anthropologist and archaeologist at University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and whom I spoke with and shared my chapter on Cahokia with, who has done a lot of research down there and has found that there's actually a lunar aspect to Cahokia as well as a solar aspect. It's been pretty well known for a long time that the Cahokians were proficient in astronomical calculations and observances. There was I guess, west of Monks Mound, there's a wood post circle, probably about, I don't know, maybe a half a mile or 3/4 of a mile directly west of Monks Mound. And on the equinoxes, the sun comes up over Monks Mound and lines up perfectly with the posts, a couple of the posts in the what has been called wood hinge sort of a takeoff on Stonehenge in Great Britain. So there's been a acknowledgement that the Cahokians were involved with solar observances, but when Tim Pawcatuck did some additional research, and not just there, but at some other mounds in that whole region down there, showed that there seemed to also be some lunar phenomena involved in the way that certain things were constructed, or even in the way that these people that were interred in some of these mounds were laid out so that their bodies were on a certain azimuth. I guess the best way to describe Cahokia is that it's a city of mounds and plazas. And it's conjectured that the Cahokians kept these mounds, they're grass covered now, but it's conjectured by some people, and there's still argument about this, that they were kept bare at the time and that they constantly worked on these to keep them from eroding and that kind of thing. But today, of course, they're grass covered now. But there was also a central plaza where archaeologists think that they played a game called chunky, which involves a stone that's rolled down this plaza, and then spears are thrown to, I guess, to see who can get closest to the stone. And some chunky stones, these, and you can tell that they've been crafted and polished and so on, are buried in some of these mounds, indicating the significance of this game. So that's something that I think perhaps a lot of people aren't aware of, although there is a wonderful visitor center there. And you can go in and find a lot of information about that. A guy named Bill Eisminger wrote, who was the assistant site manager and an archaeologist at Cahokia, wrote a book about Cahokia, and I can show you that one too. This book, and if you can see it, Cahokia Mounds by William Eisminger, is a good overview of Cahokia. Cahokia Mounds, America's first city. And then Tim Pawcatuck did a book called An Archaeology of the Cosmos, in which he looks at some of the religious practices that were going on in a number of places in ancient America, but he does devote quite a bit of space in here to Cahokia. And this book is called An Archaeology of the Cosmos. So if you're interested in learning a bit more about Cahokia, those two books, Cahokia Mounds by William Eisminger and An Archaeology of the Cosmos by Tim Pawcatuck, and a book that came out a few years ago and it's been revised once, I think, by Claudia Gelman Mink, called Cahokia, a City of the Sun. So if you're interested in Cahokia, those three books would be good ones to take a look at. And it's a fascinating place to visit. There's a sort of a air of mystery, I think, hangs over the place even yet today. And there's a lot of research continues to be carried out there to try to figure out exactly what happened to them. Tim Pawcatuck has got this theory he calls the Big Bang theory of the growth of Cahokia, where the Cahokians experienced this very large spurt of growth around 1050 or so AD, which lasted for a couple of hundred years. and then they sort of went into decline. And there's been lots of different speculations about why they went into decline, perhaps overuse of the, because there were a lot of people living there, although we don't obviously know the exact number, but there was quite a large settlement, and perhaps overuse of the resources nearby, the problem of finding enough things such as firewood within a reasonable distance, disposal of human waste and trash, that sort of thing, perhaps became significant enough that they moved away. But they left behind a very fascinating and interesting place that we can go visit today and learn a lot about these ancient people, but there's still a lot left to learn.
So do you happen to live near the Thomas log cabin, the Thomas Lincoln log cabin?
I do. It's about 10 miles from where I'm sitting right now.
Okay, because Cynthia Clampett, who I introduced you to earlier, is doing a talk there next month.
Okay.
Cynthia, do you mind, if you don't mind, Cynthia, do you mind talking about your project just for a quickie? So, because yours goes very much hand in hand with what Charlie has been doing.
Anyway, no, the reason I wondered is because I will be down there speaking next month on the history of corn. And I just thought, how far away from the Lincoln log cabin is the burial site for the Thomas Lincoln?
It is about, I would say, I think I said earlier about a mile, but I would change that. I would say it's maybe 2 miles north west.
Okay. I'm sure I could find it, but thanks. But,
yeah, it's easy to find. You won't have any difficulty finding it. It's right. It's not very far away at all.
Excellent. And thank you, Kathy, for asking about my project. What my project is it's there's a chapter on history, just sort of general history of the Midwest, because it covers the whole greater Midwest, but it's places that you can visit. The whole idea is to get you out and visiting places, not just telling you the history, but getting you out to visit the living history venues and the great museums. And I've been amused watching an awful lot of the comments, because they'll go, oh yes, this is like the oldest restaurant in Illinois. And it's like, yeah, that's in my book too. I have a whole chapter called Eating and Sleeping History, which is the oldest restaurant and the oldest hotel in each state. And then there's, exploring is like if it's a whole town. So I have Fort de Chartres, but I also have St. Genevieve, which is just across the river.
Yeah, right.
And that's an entire, it is the largest collection of French Creole colonial houses in the United States.
Yeah, post and ground houses.
Yeah, but I cover just a lot more territory, so I don't cover it quite in its depth that Charlie does. But I cover all 12 of the states of the greater Midwest. So I've got the place that Buffalo Bill used to hang out, and one of my favorites is a little restaurant in Council Groves, just named as the best small town to visit by Smithsonian Magazine.
Wow.
In Kansas, and the restaurant was built by Seth Hayes, which is Daniel Boone's great grandson and Kit Carson's cousin. And he built it. He was the first white man in the area, and he built it right on the Santa Fe Trail. So it's like layers and layers and layers and layers of history, and you can go and have a cup of coffee. So just lots of fun. So it's more of a get out there and look at stuff. And then there's an entire chapter on how to find more places, because this area, the Midwest, is just so rich with history. And I tell the joke on myself, it's like I'd actually been to Australia 4 times before I saw the Chicago Botanic Gardens, because I don't think we think of the Midwest, even if we live in the Midwest.
Yeah.
It's like you go to Europe, you don't go to Chicago.
Yeah. And I think that, hopefully your book, because it encourages people to travel, and mine does too here within the state, maybe they're coming along at just about the right time now that are feeling a little bit better about getting out and going places. So maybe they're coming at the right time. But
I'm hoping so.
That sounds terrific. Yeah.
Well, there's just a lot of fun places, and
And I think Charlie's book is going to be living in my car for a while, because it's history. So it's not like and I'm not talking to you, but like I used to keep Jane and Michael Stern's books in my car for road food, which now you have to go check the internet. But back then, those books were gold and lived in the car for a number of years. But as we traipse around Illinois, certainly I'm going to be taking your book with me, because you do often, history is a little bit more finite in the sense of my restaurant guides. I drove 2 hours one night and they said it closed 6 months ago, and they gave me this puzzled look like, why the heck are you here?
Well, and there were in this book there are 20 chapters in here, but there is also there's also an appendix that has several other places that just has a sort of a thumbnail, just we called it additional sites of interest. And again, it's broken into Northern Illinois, Chicago area, and Central Illinois, and so on. And then it has just a paragraph or two and no illustrations about those. So there could have been probably another book like that done. Somebody who was reviewing the book said, well, you didn't do anything about Fort Dearborn. And that's true, I didn't, but there isn't anything there but a plaque on the sidewalk showing where it was. And what I tried to do was use this concept that geographers at one time used in geographic education, a concept of place, where you take a location and then you look at what's going on, what went on, and what is now going on at that location.
Yes.
I tried to use that concept of place, and you can't very well do that if there's nothing left but sure, you could give the history of the place, but what I wanted to do here was sort of say, okay, here's this place, here's what went on there, and Lincoln Log Cabin historic site today, or New Salem today.
Yes.
So I tried to pick sites that had some physical characteristics, some built environment kind of stuff there. So that's kind of why certain sorts of places. I didn't do any of the 7 Lake and Douglas debate sites either, because I think there's only maybe one of those that even has anything, and I might be wrong on this, but I think there's only one of those maybe that has anything there that would have been contemporaneous with the time. One here in town in Charleston was one of the debate sites in September of 1857, I guess. There's a Lincoln Douglas Debate Museum there, but that's a contemporary structure. The place where the debate took place was on what's now the fairground, and it's just an open field there where the carnival rides set up when the fair comes. Yeah. So I didn't do any of those. I didn't do Fort Dearborn, but I did do those others that are in that appendix that I didn't do in the 20 chapters.
Well, it's just, I think between the two of us, we have definitely shown people that there is something to do if you're in the Midwest.
Oh, you bet. Yeah, it's a great area. And I was so glad to see here, what has it been now? I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years ago, when this Midwest History Association got off the ground, and sort of did just what we're talking about. Sort of say, hey, folks, we've got all kinds of rich colonial history. We've got all kinds of Western history. We've got Southern history. We even have a Southern history professional association and so on. But don't forget, there was something in the Midwest too. We've got part of the country too here. So I was glad to see that organ, and I think it's gone quite well.
Yeah. And especially because I've been going to their meetings, I've gone to most of them, is that the publishers and the documentations of the magazines that would support the history in this, where people could have a place to be published, were disappearing. You know, it was like, yeah, there's people doing stuff, but how do you even show it off?
How do you get it out? Yeah. Yeah. So I'm glad they did that. And I think I think it goes back, Cynthia, to what you were saying, that there's a lot in the Midwest and in Illinois, but in the Midwestern region to see that has significance, has importance.
And by the way, I did one time, and I have to say, people told me nobody would come, but I did a little tour between Bloomington Normal and Lincoln, Illinois. And we unearthed, and I was there with an anthropologist who had lived in Bloomington Normal for the last like 35, 40 years. We accidentally unearthed a Lincoln era rivalry. We went to the Davis Mansion in Bloomington.
Right, right.
And then we went to, okay, you know, that small maple syrup farm, Funk's Grove. Well, there's a Funk family home. And it says it has one of the first electrified kitchens in the United States. One of them had gone to the Columbian exhibition and then was so energized by it, he went and learned very early electrical engineering. But here's the deal. When we walked into the Funk home, the guy said, so where have you been before? And I said, well, we were at the Davis Mansion. What? Mrs. Davis insulted Mrs. Funk. And we're talking Civil War era issues.
So that feud is still going on.
Yes. Were you aware of that one, by the way?
No,
of course.
wasn't.
My friend who's been there for 35 years didn't know anything. He's like, how the heck did you pull that one off?
Yeah.
Well, Charlie, thank you so much. This was
Absolutely.
a terrific evening. And I have to say, we're just all been hanging on, listening to every word.
It's been fun.
Yes, it's
Well,
been
thank
fun.
you. I appreciate the opportunity to join you, and I appreciate the good work that the Highland Park Historical Society is doing, and it's been my pleasure to be with you this evening.